She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. Her hands were folded. The lawyer's card was face down beside her coffee cup. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her eyes went past me. Not to me. Past me. Like she was checking to see if I'd come alone. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I had spent 31 years being a good daughter. Not a perfect one. A good one. I showed up. I called. I drove 4 hours when her hip went bad. I sat in waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse lighting, and I held her hand through every hard thing. My husband, Daniel, had been beside me for 11 of those years. Mostly. Daniel is the kind of man who is very good at appearing present. He nods at the right moments. He says the right things at family dinners. He carries things when there are things to carry. But if you watch him long enough, and I had been watching him for 11 years, you start to notice the moments when he quietly leaves the room. Not physically. Just inwardly. The first real crack happened about 8 months ago. My mother had a fall. Nothing catastrophic. A cracked rib, some bruising, a hospital stay that lasted 2 nights. But she was 68 years old, living alone in the house where I grew up, and the fall had shaken something loose in her. Not just physically. She became anxious in a way I hadn't seen before. She started calling more. She started asking questions she'd never asked, about her finances, about her paperwork, about who had copies of what. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Fear does that to people. But then she asked Daniel for help. She needed someone to drive her to a financial appointment. Her accountant. A routine annual review. She called me first, but I was in the middle of a work obligation I couldn't move. So she called Daniel. He said he was busy. He wasn't busy. I was home that evening. He'd spent the afternoon watching something on his laptop and grilling chicken. I know because I was there. When I asked him about it later, he said he forgot. Then he said the timing was off. Then he said my mother was capable of managing on her own. 3 different answers. That's the thing about people who aren't telling the truth. They don't pick one story and stay in it. My mother ended up taking a taxi. She didn't say anything to me about Daniel's refusal. I only found out because her neighbor, an older woman named Pat, mentioned in passing that she'd seen my mother getting into a cab looking a little unsteady. I brought it up gently to my mother. She brushed it off. She said it was fine. She said Daniel was a busy man. But her voice was flat when she said it. I'd known my mother for 31 years. Flat wasn't her voice. A few weeks later, I noticed something had changed in how she spoke to me on the phone. She was still warm. Still herself. But there were pauses. Little hesitations before she answered certain questions. If I asked about her plans, she'd give me half an answer and then redirect. If I mentioned Daniel, she'd go quiet for just a half-second too long before moving on. I mentioned it to Daniel. He said I was reading into things. He said my mother was getting older and sometimes older people got a little strange. He said it gently, almost kindly, in the way that makes you feel like the problem is your perception and not the reality in front of you. I almost believed him. I'm good at almost believing him. I've had practice. But then I visited her on a Sunday in October. Unannounced. Just drove down because I missed her and because something I couldn't name was pulling at me. She was happy to see me. Genuinely. We had tea. We walked around her garden. It was a good afternoon. But when I went to use the bathroom, I passed the door to her small study, and I noticed her desk was different. She had always kept it a certain way, stacked, organized by her own logic, a system only she understood. But now it was bare. The surface was almost empty. The drawers were closed in a way that felt deliberate. I didn't say anything. I came back to the living room and we finished our tea and I drove home. And I thought about those empty drawers the entire 4 hours back. Daniel was asleep by the time I got in. I stood in the kitchen for a while, just standing in the dark, going over things. The taxi. The flat voice. The half answers. The empty desk. The lawyer's card face down on the table. Separately, they were nothing. Together, they were a shape I didn't like. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. I started small. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask direct questions. I just paid attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I started noticing what was said, what wasn't said, and most importantly, what changed when I wasn't supposed to be watching. The first thing I did was call Pat. Pat is 71 years old, lives 3 houses down from my mother, and has been her neighbor for over 2 decades. She's not a gossip. She's an observer. There's a difference. Gossips embellish. Observers just remember. I told her I was checking in on my mother and asked casually if she'd noticed anything different lately. Pat was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, that my mother had been having visitors. I asked who. She said she didn't know the man. Medium height. Drove a silver car. Had come 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Always on weekdays. Always when, as far as Pat could tell, I wasn't around. I asked her if she'd ever seen my mother look uncomfortable around him. Another pause. Pat said she wouldn't use the word uncomfortable. She'd use the word careful. I thanked her and hung up. I sat with that for a day. Then I called my mother's accountant's office. Not to speak to him, just to confirm whether she'd rescheduled the appointment Daniel had refused to drive her to. I told the receptionist I was her daughter and that my mother had asked me to check the date. The receptionist looked it up. My mother had not rescheduled. She had cancelled entirely. That appointment had been a routine annual review she'd kept every single year for the past 14 years without missing once. I wrote that down. I started writing everything down. The next piece came from my mother herself. Without her knowing, she gave it to me. I called her on a Tuesday evening. We talked about nothing for a while, her garden, a book she was reading, the weather. Then I asked her, very casually, if she'd sorted out her financial review yet. She said yes. She said everything was taken care of. But here is what she didn't say. She didn't say she'd rescheduled with her accountant. She didn't mention him by name. She just said taken care of. And then she moved the conversation somewhere else very smoothly, the way you move something fragile away from the edge of a table. My mother is not a smooth person. She's warm and direct and sometimes blunt. She does not redirect. She answers. Except she hadn't. I let it go. I said goodnight. I told her I loved her. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and I looked up the estate laws in our state. I spent 3 hours reading. I'm not a lawyer. But I'm a careful reader. And what I understood by midnight was this: a person can change their will at any time, for any reason, as long as they are of sound mind and not acting under undue influence. Undue influence. I wrote that phrase down and underlined it. The next week, I drove down on a Wednesday. I didn't tell my mother I was coming. I timed it so I'd arrive mid-morning, when she was usually in the garden. She was. I parked down the street and I waited. At 11:17, a silver car pulled up. The man who got out was in his mid-50s. Neat. Unhurried. He carried a soft leather folder under his arm. He knocked. My mother answered quickly, like she'd been expecting him. She glanced once up the street before she stepped aside to let him in. I sat in my car and I breathed. I didn't go to the door. I didn't follow him in. I took photographs from my car, the silver car, the plate number, the man's face as he walked up the path. Then I waited. He was inside for 40 minutes. When he left, he was still carrying the leather folder. I waited until his car was out of sight. Then I drove around the block, pulled up to my mother's house, and knocked like I'd just arrived. She opened the door and her face did something complicated for just a moment. Then she smiled and pulled me in and put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd seen the lawyer's card weeks before. I looked without looking. There was nothing on the table now. But there was a faint rectangular mark in the slight dust near the edge, the size of a leather folder. Fresh. Recent. I photographed the plate number that evening and ran it through a basic search. It came back registered to a law firm 40 minutes from my mother's town. Not her usual lawyer. Not anyone she'd ever mentioned. I looked up the firm. They handled estate planning. wills, trust amendments, asset restructuring. I called Daniel that evening from a different room. I asked him again, casually, if anything had happened between him and my mother. If there'd been any tension he hadn't told me about. He said no. He said everything was fine. He said I worried too much. I listened to his voice. I listened to the certainty in it. He didn't know what I'd seen that day. He didn't know about the photographs. He didn't know I'd been watching for weeks. He was answering the question he thought I was asking. Not the one I actually was. I went to bed that night and I lay there in the dark and I thought about my mother's face when she opened the door. That complicated flicker. What was in it? It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to relief. Like she'd been waiting to be caught. Like some part of her wanted me to know. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof that would hold. Confronting them would have ruined everything. I gave myself 1 week. Not to grieve. Not to panic. 1 week to think clearly and move carefully. Because everything I did next had to be right. Not fast. Right. The first thing I did was write everything down in order. Every date. Every observation. Every phone call. Every inconsistency. I typed it out in a plain document, clinical and factual, like I was writing a report for someone who didn't know any of the people involved. No emotion in it. Just sequence. Just facts. Then I saved it in 3 places. My personal cloud. An external drive I kept at my office. And I emailed it to myself from a secondary account I created specifically for this purpose. An account no one else knew about. Not Daniel. Not anyone. Then I looked at what I actually had. I had photographs of the silver car and the man who drove it. I had a plate number registered to an estate law firm my mother had never mentioned. I had a cancelled accountant appointment she'd kept for 14 consecutive years. I had Pat's account of repeated weekday visits. I had my mother's redirected answers on the phone. I had a fresh rectangular mark in the dust of a table where a leather folder had recently been placed. Individually, each one was explainable. Together, they told a story. But a story isn't evidence. Not the kind that protects you. Not the kind that holds up. I needed to know what was actually in that folder. I called my mother on a Thursday and asked if I could come for the weekend. She said yes, warmly, the way she always did. I came on Friday evening. I brought food. I made dinner. We watched something on television and I stayed the night in my old room. Saturday morning, she went to her garden early. She always did. It was her ritual, an hour outside before the day started, just her and the plants and the quiet. I went to her study. I didn't search. I didn't rifle through anything. I stood in the doorway and I looked. The desk was still bare on top. But there was a new file organizer on the shelf beside the window. Blue. Neat. Labeled in her handwriting. One of the tabs read, Legal, Current. I took a photograph of the shelf from where I stood. I didn't touch it. Then I went back to the kitchen and started making coffee. When she came in from the garden, we had breakfast. I helped her with some weeding in the afternoon. We talked about her sister, about a trip she was thinking of taking, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. At one point she looked at me over her teacup and said, quietly, that she hoped I knew she loved me. I said I knew. She nodded and looked out the window. I drove home Sunday afternoon. And on Monday morning, I called an attorney. Not a general attorney. A specific kind. I found her through a referral from a colleague at work, a woman who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. Her name was Karen Ellison. She had 20 years of experience and a manner on the phone that was calm and exact, the kind of calm that comes from having seen most things already. I told her I needed a consultation. I told her I believed my mother might be in the process of changing her estate documents under circumstances that concerned me. I told her I had a timeline and photographs and I wanted to understand what my legal options were and what, if anything, I was obligated to do. She asked me 3 questions. Was my mother mentally competent? To my knowledge, yes. Was she physically safe? To my knowledge, yes. Did I have any reason to believe someone was threatening or coercing her directly? I paused on that one. I said I didn't have proof of direct coercion. But I had reason to believe she was being influenced by someone outside her established circle of advisors, in a way she was actively concealing from me. Karen Ellison said, "Come in Thursday." I went in Thursday with my timeline printed out, my photographs, and a handwritten log of every phone call I'd noticed the behavioral shift in. I sat across from her desk and I walked her through it, calmly, in order, the way I'd written it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The concealment itself is significant. If your mother were simply choosing to update her will, which is her right, there would be no reason to hide the visits, cancel established appointments, or redirect your questions. The pattern you're describing suggests she is either being advised to keep this private, or she has agreed to keep it private on someone else's behalf." She asked me one more question. She asked if my husband had any connection to the estate. Any financial interest in how it was structured. I hadn't considered that. I told her I didn't know. She said, "Find out." I drove home and I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Daniel was in the kitchen when I walked in. He asked how my day was. I said fine. I asked how his was. He said fine. We made dinner together like we had 1,000 times before. We talked about small things. He laughed at something on his phone and showed me. I smiled. And I thought about Karen Ellison's question. Any financial interest? I started quietly that evening. I went back through our joint account statements for the past year. Then his personal account, which I had access to but rarely checked. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just looking. It took me 4 evenings spread over 2 weeks to find it. A series of transfers. Small enough individually not to stand out. Large enough together to mean something. Going into an account I didn't recognize. Not a business account. Personal. In a name I didn't know. I cross-referenced the name against the law firm I'd found through the plate number. It wasn't a direct match. But it was close enough to make my hands go still on the keyboard. I took screenshots. I saved them in all 3 places. I sent everything to Karen Ellison the next morning. She called me back within 2 hours. Her voice was still calm. But there was a new precision in it, the kind that meant she'd shifted from advising to acting. She said, "I think we need to move carefully and we need to move soon." I agreed. We made a plan. My mother had a standing Sunday lunch every month with a small group of old friends. She'd kept it for years. She would be out of the house for at least 3 hours. We scheduled for the following Sunday. Daniel thought I was visiting a friend that afternoon. My mother thought I was at home. No one knew where I actually was or what I was carrying in the folder under my arm when I walked into Karen Ellison's office at 1 o'clock on a Sunday and sat down across from her and 2 colleagues she'd brought in specifically for this meeting. The room was quiet. Professional. The kind of quiet that precedes something that cannot be undone. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. Karen Ellison had prepared 3 documents before I arrived. I didn't ask her to rush. She hadn't. Everything in that folder had been assembled with the kind of precision that takes time and intention. She walked me through each page without hurrying, explaining what it meant in plain language, making sure I understood not just what we were doing but why it would hold. The first document was a formal letter of concern addressed to the law firm connected to that silver car. It cited the pattern of undisclosed visits, the cancellation of established financial appointments, and the financial transfers I had identified through the joint accounts. It did not accuse. It did not threaten. It simply stated, in measured legal language, that the circumstances surrounding any recent amendments to my mother's estate documents would be subject to formal scrutiny should those documents be executed or contested. The second document was a request filed with the State Bar's Ethics Oversight Office, asking for a review of the unnamed attorney's conduct regarding potential undue influence on an elderly client. The third was a letter to my mother's longtime attorney, the one she'd used for over 2 decades, informing him professionally that there appeared to be parallel legal activity occurring around his client's estate without his knowledge or involvement. Karen looked at me when we finished reviewing them. She said, once these go out, things will begin to move. Are you ready for that? I said yes. She sent them that afternoon. I drove home and made dinner. Daniel came in around 6. He was in a good mood. He'd been to the gym. He talked about something he'd heard on a podcast. He ate 2 helpings and complimented the food. He was relaxed in the way that people are relaxed when they believe nothing is coming for them. I listened and nodded and cleared the plates. That night I lay awake for a long time. Not anxious. Just awake. Thinking about my mother sitting at that kitchen table with the lawyer's card face down beside her coffee cup. Thinking about the complicated flicker in her face when she opened the door and found me standing there unannounced. The flicker that looked like relief. I thought about 31 years of showing up. I thought about a cracked rib and a taxi and a man who said he was busy. I didn't feel angry. I just felt clear. The first response came within 4 days. The law firm sent a reply to Karen. It was formal and careful and said very little directly, which told us everything indirectly. Firms that have nothing to hide respond with straightforward denials. This letter had the shape of people deciding how much they needed to explain. Karen said that was useful. The second response came from my mother's longtime attorney. He called Karen directly. He was, she told me afterward, not happy. He had not been informed of any changes. He had not been consulted. He had received no communication from his client in over 3 months, which he had attributed to her simply not needing anything. He had not known about the silver car or the visits or the leather folder. He asked Karen what she needed from him. Karen told him. He said he would make a call. He called my mother on a Wednesday. I know this because she called me that same evening. Her voice was different. Not flat this time. Not careful. Something quieter than that. Something that sounded like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. She asked if she could see me. I said of course. I said I'd come Friday. She said, bring time. We have things to talk about. I arrived Friday morning. She had tea already made. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and she told me everything. It had started, she said, with Daniel. Not long after his refusal to drive her to the accountant. He had called her privately, a few days later, and apologized. Warmly. Convincingly. He'd said he felt terrible. He'd said he wanted to make it up to her. He'd said he'd been thinking about her situation, living alone, managing everything herself, and that he'd been talking to someone who specialized in helping people in her position organize their affairs more efficiently. He said he just wanted to help. She was 68 years old and she had just fallen and cracked a rib and she was frightened in a way she hadn't admitted to anyone. And here was her son-in-law, calling to apologize and offering help. So she listened. The man with the leather folder was an attorney Daniel had found. Not a reputable one, as it turned out. Karen's inquiry to the State Bar had already surfaced 2 prior complaints against him, both involving elderly clients and estate amendments that disproportionately benefited third parties. Over 6 weeks, through careful and patient conversation, this attorney had guided my mother toward amending her will in ways that, on paper, looked like sensible planning. A trust structure. A financial oversight role. Assigned to Daniel. She hadn't understood the full implications. She is intelligent, my mother, but estate law is deliberately complex and she had been frightened and lonely and someone she trusted had told her this was the right thing to do. She hadn't told me because Daniel had suggested, gently, that it might cause unnecessary worry. That I had enough on my plate. That this was a gift, really, one less thing for me to manage someday. When she finished telling me, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think I knew something was wrong. I think that's why I kept looking past you when you walked in that day. I was ashamed. I reached across the table and held her hand. I didn't say anything for a little while. Then I told her about Karen Ellison. About the timeline I'd kept. About the photographs and the account transfers and the 3 documents that had gone out 10 days ago. I told her all of it, in order, calmly. She listened the way she used to listen when I was small and had something important to tell her, completely still, completely present. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You didn't confront him." I said no. She said, "You just watched." I said yes. She nodded slowly, like that made sense to her in a way that went beyond the situation. Like it told her something about who I was that she already knew but was seeing clearly for the first time. The amended will was never executed. The attorney surrendered his involvement before the documents were finalized, likely on advice of his own counsel after Karen's letter arrived. The State Bar opened a formal inquiry. It is ongoing. Daniel was confronted. Not by me. By my mother's longtime attorney, who requested a meeting and presented him with the financial transfer records and a clear summary of what had been established. The attorney had a colleague present. Everything was documented. Daniel did not shout. He did not deny cleanly. He offered explanations that shifted and contradicted themselves, 3 different answers, the same way he always did when he wasn't telling the truth. He came home that evening and tried to talk to me. I told him I had already spoken to a separate attorney about our personal situation. I told him I had documentation. I told him I was not interested in a conversation. He left 3 weeks later. The process that followed was not easy. But it was straightforward, because I had been careful and Karen Ellison was very good at her job. My mother updated her will with her longtime attorney present, her own choices, no leather folder from a stranger sitting on the table. She told me afterward that she'd left things exactly as she'd always intended. I told her it didn't matter. She said it did. I visit her most Sundays now. We have tea at the kitchen table. We talk about her garden and her books and the small ordinary things that make up a life. Pat sometimes joins us. The conversation is easy and unhurried. My mother looks less frightened than she did a year ago. She looks like herself. The version of herself that existed before a fall and a cracked rib and a man with a leather folder started quietly rearranging things. I don't think about Daniel much. When I do, it isn't with anger. It's with the particular clarity that comes from having understood something fully. He had looked at my mother and seen an asset. He had looked at me and seen someone too trusting to notice. He had been wrong about both of us. I never raised my voice. I never made accusations in a room where I couldn't prove them. I never gave him the argument he would have known how to win. I just watched. And documented. And moved carefully when the time was right. My mother held my hand across the kitchen table and she wasn't ashamed anymore. That was enough. That was more than enough. That night, everything was quiet.